this morning comes from the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, verses 21 through 26. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, "You shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment." But I tell you, anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, "Raka," is answerable to the court, and anyone who says, "You fool," will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. Go and be reconciled to them. Then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge. The judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown in prison. Truly, I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny.
Shalom, Havarim. Hello, friends. Good to see you this brisk Sunday morning. My goodness, we had a nice warm week and things quickly changed. But a lot of animals in the world are very large. They take up a lot of space. Like, start naming some big animals, like elephants. Everybody thinks of elephants and hippos and whales. All of these are really big animals. Cows are very large. Do you know what the biggest animal is? Like, what takes up the most, square foot of land? The ground hog. The ground hog. And do you know what a groundhog's favorite drink is? What? Whole milk. No, in all seriousness, we always had groundhogs on the farm growing up. They're nuisances. They would dig holes out in the field. You'd be driving along, you hit the hole with the tractor tire. Sometimes my mom actually once split her head wide open because her head hit the steering wheel on a tractor, and I got the joy of taking her to the hospital to get stitches. That was fun. I got off track there a little bit. Memories coming back. Groundhogs, they look cute on TV. They hold up Punxsutawney Phil, and he's probably a well cared for and well cleaned animal. But they're actually really gross and kind of stinky. And do you know how a groundhog smells? With its nose. That's it. Last groundhog joke for the morning, because it is, of course, Groundhog Day. Word on the street is that Punxsutawney Phil got up early this morning, saw his shadow, and we will have 6 more weeks of sermon series on Anabaptism. So, 6 more weeks till I stop. I will never stop. So we are in week 3 of our sermon series on Anabaptism at 500. On January 21st, we celebrated 500 years since our church movement began, the Anabaptist tradition, out of which the Mennonites, the Amish, the Hutterites, and some will say the Brethren, and even certain portions of the Baptist church all come out of this Anabaptist tradition. So for the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about these different topics within the Anabaptist tradition. We've been looking at some central tenets, and upon voting from this congregation, people said, we want to hear more about this, so we're going to extend it until the beginning of Lent, the first part of March. So far we have covered these topics. Those first 2 have been discussed. The first week we looked at the free church tradition. A part of the Anabaptist tradition is you choose to be a part. You aren't simply a part because you're born into a tradition. You aren't forced to be a part because of who your parents are or who is king or who is in a leadership position. You make the decision for yourself to be a part of the church. Last week we looked at Christianity as discipleship. To be a Christian isn't simply just to have this mental assent that you believe certain things, that you can check a certain box off and say, I believe this, so therefore I'm a Christian. We say that Christianity is about following Jesus, discipleship, following him in his teachings and as he actually lived. The 16th century Anabaptists called it Nach fulge Christi, something like that, following after Christ. This is what it meant to be a Christian. You still want to act and live as Jesus lived. So I went through this list and I said all of these other things really fall underneath discipleship. These things make no sense outside of being a follower of Jesus. You can believe in certain things, and then this makes no sense to say, like, well, why should I be forgiving other people? Like, that's just weak. Or why should I be nonviolent? Or why should I try to live simply? Or why should we practice communal hermeneutics? It doesn't make any sense. These things abstracted from discipleship, abstracted from this idea that we are called to also follow Jesus in his word and example, simply don't make sense. When we come together as a unit, then and only then do they truly make sense. So what we're going to do today is we're going to walk through some kind of practical reasons why forgiveness is important. And I connect forgiveness and enemy love together because it's really hard to love your enemy if you don't forgive them. We'll also kind of spill enemy love into nonviolence next week. But we're going to talk about some practical reasons why this is important, why we love our enemies, why we forgive people who have hurt us. And then we're going to spend some time in the biblical examples and why Jesus tells us this is so central to following him. We're going to flip back around then and have a few examples then from the 16th century Anabaptists as well. And hopefully, maybe some of you have heard these stories before, but hopefully you're still challenged in a new way to practice enemy love and forgiveness. Make sense? All right, let's go ahead and get into this. So I think I showed the kids, I don't know, maybe they didn't get it at all. One of the most practical reasons for forgiving someone is because by not forgiving someone that hurts you, you aren't actually doing anything to get them back. Like, it gains you nothing. Like, you benefit in no way. It's not like that person that cut you off the other day as you were trying to pull into Dunkin' Donuts is sitting there feeling like, oh man, I feel so bad about this because this person hasn't forgiven me yet. They probably moved on. They don't even care. But if you're stewing over this, if it's still taking up space, living rent-free in your head, it will affect you. It's like trying to hold on to that weight as the kids were doing. I have one here. I'm not going to do it. That's hard work. It's like holding on to that weight. Even though that's like 7.5 pounds, the longer you hold on to it, the harder it becomes. You eventually need to let that go for no other reason than to let yourself heal and to become more yourself and who you were created to be. I like this quote by Anne Lamott, who is a popular author. She says, "In fact, not forgiving is like drinking rat poison and then waiting for the rat to die." You're not hurting the rat when you drink the poison, and that is what a lack of forgiveness is. It is poisoning you. It affects you. It hurts your sleep cycle. It affects your day-to-day life. So not forgiving someone hurts you and you alone. And I like the way that Dave Willis puts it, a little more nuanced. He says, holding a grudge doesn't make you strong. It makes you bitter. Forgiving doesn't make you weak. It sets you free. Now, anytime I talk about forgiveness in the church, I think sometimes we misunderstand what that really means. And we can take it in ways that are not healthy as well. And the first thing I want to say is the phrase forgive and forget, that's not biblical. So just because I'm telling people that they should forgive doesn't mean that you totally forget about that thing that just happened. And what I mean by that is sometimes whenever you forgive somebody, that doesn't mean that you place them in a position that they can continue to do harm to a person. So I think about it like this. We forgive, but we still hold others accountable for their actions. If somebody has a history of saying verbally abusive things to children, you may forgive that person for hurting your child, but that doesn't mean you put them in a position like a Sunday school teacher, right? We still hold them accountable for those things. I don't know who would ever be verbally abusive to a child, but that's just something that came to mind. You still hold them accountable for the decisions that they made. I saw the Bible quizzing team laughing back there. Hopefully there's no verbal abuse in the Bible quizzing industry. Here's my way of understanding it. Forgiveness, as we have phrased it, sometimes has a little bit, I think we misunderstand it, but this is the way I like to word it. You don't see so much forgiveness, you can't see it, but you can see signs of forgiveness. And a sign of forgiveness is wishing the best for someone, wanting them to grow and thrive, even though they have hurt you. So again, even though they've hurt you, you want what's best for them. So there's a few stories within our Anabaptist tradition that anytime we talk about forgiveness, we really have to circle back and touch on these things. And of course, I think I'd be making a mistake if I didn't at least mention the 2006 Amish schoolhouse shooting. So you maybe remember the story. It was 2006, August 2nd, when a man named Charles Roberts was driving. He drove a milk truck in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Charles Roberts showed up at a one-room Amish schoolhouse that morning with a bag full of guns, ammos, tools, 2x4s, nails, and screws. He went into the Amish schoolhouse and he sent all the boys out of the building, and just leaving the young women and girls in the facility. He then barricaded the doors with the 2x4s, closed himself in there, and he began shooting the young girls execution style. He shot 10 different young girls, killing 6 of them, ages 6 through 13. Now, we know this story in part because it's an absolutely terrible incident. Who would ever think to do such a thing? What kind of evil is present in this world? It's very much a news headline kind of story. But I think the thing that we remember the most from this experience isn't just the terrible event that took place, but the response of the Amish community. Because within hours after this event de-escalated, Charles Roberts then shot himself in the head and killed himself on the scene. But within hours of this event, what was the response of the Amish community? They did what? They forgave the family. They forgave Charles Roberts. And of course, all of the community is like, well, that seems like that's fast. How can you forgive already? Is it even your place to forgive? But this is a part of who they are, a part of their DNA to forgive. And we hear these stories about how the father of Charles Roberts went and met with a bishop in the Amish church, and wept in his arms for about an hour long. And we hear all these stories about this act of forgiveness, and it is truly moving. But the thing that impresses me all these years later is that we hear these stories about Charles Roberts' family. Remember, he was married. He had 3 young kids at the time as well. So during the aftermath of this event, all this money was coming in. All these donations were being made to rebuild the Amish school, to care for the families, to provide for their health care. One of the children just passed away this past fall. She lived in a wheelchair for, 18 years. Medical expenses. So all this money came in. Millions of dollars came in. And the amazing thing for me is that the Amish community made a decision to set aside a large portion of that money for Charles Roberts' widow and children, caring for the people that he left behind. Do you remember how I described forgiveness? That's not the one I wanted. That bottom line. A sign of forgiveness is wishing the best for someone, wanting them to grow and thrive even though they have hurt you. That is my concept of what it means to forgive. So let's look at some of the biblical examples to pick things up a little bit. Anybody got a good Groundhog Day joke? No. So I had Lois read a couple of different passages for us this morning. I'm going to jump around a little bit to give some holistic kind of understanding about forgiveness. And one of the passages that Lois read for us was from the Sermon on the Mount. And I really like this passage. We start with those antitheses. You have heard it said, but I say unto you. And one of those is, you have heard it said, thou shalt not murder. Straight out of the 10 Commandments. And then Jesus takes it up a notch, says, don't just not murder people. Don't just not murder. Jesus had a problem with double negatives. Don't even get angry at people. He's like, cut it off. Cut the snake off at the head. Is that a saying? Is that a thing? Cut it off before it becomes a problem. Don't even get angry with somebody. Don't even call them Raka, because we know we all have that problem. We're calling people Raka all the time. Don't even call them a fool. Just don't go there, and you won't have to worry about the next step. You don't even have to worry about not murdering someone if you just never even get angry. And then he goes on to tell this story And he tells a story about how if you are making an offering, if you have your gift on the altar, and you're in that act of worship, and you remember at that time that there's a brother or a sister out there that is angry at you for something, leave the altar there, leave the offering on the altar, and then go and make things right with the other person. I like this for a couple reasons. First, it's a good reminder that sometimes it's not people sinning against you, it's not just people hurting you. Sometimes we hurt other people too. Anybody else guilty of that? Just me? Sometimes we hurt others too. And here he is prioritizing. And this is Jesus himself talking, right? He's prioritizing making things right with other people, being reconciled with others. He's prioritizing that over our acts of worship. So if there's somebody that you have something against or you think has something against you, like that's permission right now to get up and leave worship, to go, no, don't go anywhere. No. Prioritizing reconciliation with others even over worship. I think that's a beautiful point. I think he's saying, God's going to wait for you. God will still be around. That other person, they may not. Go make that right before things get worse. So his phrase is here in Matthew 5:24. First, go and be reconciled to them. Then come and offer your gift. If we jump then to chapter 18 of Matthew, this is a passage that's just full of stories of forgiveness and reconciliation. If we jump into the passage before where Lois actually began reading, there's this idea of if a brother or sister sins against you, first go to them one-on-one and try to make it right. We know the way this works. If that doesn't work, you're supposed to then bring 2 or 3 witnesses, and if that doesn't work, you tell it to the church. And the idea behind this passage isn't so that you can kind of get somebody and catch them in the act. You're like, ha-ha, see, I've got witnesses. We caught you. The whole reason for doing this is because you're trying to restore that relationship. This is not about punishment. This is not about pointing out to someone their shortcomings. This is about trying to make it right with other people, to be reconciled. And I love this story because then Peter has this wonderful line. And Peter's that guy, he's always jumping in, doesn't really think things through. Here's that again. I need to skip over that. He's not always thinking it through. And Peter jumps in and he says in verse 21, he says, Lord, how many times should I forgive my brother or sister who sins against me? Up to 7 times? And I love this because Peter, can you hear him patting himself on the back here? That carries over. I can hear this all these years later. He's almost bragging, I tend to be a very forgiving person. But Jesus, I might even forgive up to, 7 times? He's wanting some sort of congratulations from Jesus. Well done. You are a very gracious person. And how does Jesus respond? He says, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times. G. No, wait, if you've read this passage before, you know why it's there. He's not calling him G. It should be comma G. No. Why is that G there? I left that footnote there for a reason. Do you remember why? Right, there's 2 different ways to interpret the passage here because it's not clear in the original language. Jesus answered, I tell you, not 7 times, but 77 times is one way. Or the other one would be 70 times 7. Greek is not written in the right order. You have to go ahead and kind of piecemeal things together. So it's not clear whether Jesus said 77 times or 70 times 7. A lot of people want to go with the 70 times 7 because that's big. That's 490 times. But others will say, well, either way, he's just trying to say, forgive a lot. There's no limit, not an upper limit to how many times you forgive. I prefer the lower number for a reason. And that reason is that Jesus was speaking to a particular crowd here. He's speaking to Jewish people. And the Jewish people would know their Hebrew Bible. Well, they just called it the Bible. They knew the Torah much better than we do. And whenever they hear these numbers, not 7 times, but 70 times 7, they would go back to the story of Cain slaying his brother Abel. We go all the way back to Genesis chapter 4, and maybe you remember this story. These 2 brothers had a little bit of a fight with each other. There's some jealousy going on, and Cain kills his brother. You think your kids fight a lot? Cain kills Abel, and then Cain gets kicked out of the world. He's kicked out of the world. He's made to wander the world for the rest of his life. He's scared because evidently he thinks someone is going to kill him. Don't know why. We don't know where these other people came from, but he's afraid that he's going to be killed if other people find him. So God marks Cain with some sort of mark that we don't know what that means, but he says that if anybody messes with you, Cain, they will be repaid 7 times for what they do to you. Okay? You hear that number? How many times? 7 times. So that's Genesis chapter 4. Turn a few verses later, still in that same chapter, we read about Cain's descendant Lamech. Now, Lamech was a bit of a jerk. He was a power-hungry dude. And we find this passage about Lamech, he's kind of boasting. It's a couple of generations after Cain. He says, I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech, how many times? 77 times. So there's different ways that we can read this passage from Jesus. Maybe he's just saying forgive a whole bunch of times. It might be as many as 490 times. It might be infinite number of times. I think what he's doing here is he's undoing this practice of revenge and seeking vengeance. Not 7 times, Peter, but 77 times. Peter would have heard that and probably thought of Lamech and his proclamation. I will be revenged 77 times. And then, as Jesus often does, one more story, maybe 2 more from the Bible. He breaks into a parable. Like Peter comes to him with like a serious question, and what's he do? He's like, let me tell you a story. So he tells this story about how there's a king. And this king decides that it's time for his people to pay up. They have debts to be paid, and he needs some money. So he calls in all of his debtors. And he says, you need to pay now. This one guy comes into the king's throne room, and he sits before the king, and he has no money to pay back. And he realized that he will never be able to pay back this debt. It says that he owes the king 10,000 talents. That is the equivalent of 200,000 years worth of wages. My question is, who keeps lending this guy money? That's bad stewardship. I think after 100,000 years, you're going to like, maybe we shouldn't give this guy any more money. The guy comes in, there's no way that he can pay this debt, and he asks the king simply for mercy. And the king says, you know what, just forget it. You're forgiven. That guy walks out then, and he finds another man, and this man owes him money. This man owes him 100 denarii, about 3/4 of a year's wages. That's not insignificant, right? Like, take what you make for a year, divide it by 3, multiply it times 4, carry the remainder. I don't know how math works. Multiply it times 0.75, and that's significant, right? It's not insignificant. But this guy, because he cannot pay, the man who owes less, the guy who's just been forgiven, has this guy thrown into debtor's prison. Now, the moral of the story seems to be that those who have been forgiven the most tend to be the least likely to forgive others. And shouldn't it be the other way? Those of us who have experienced forgiveness should be the first to offer forgiveness to others. Whether it's forgiveness from God or forgiveness from others, we should be the first ones to offer forgiveness to other people. So this is the story that Jesus tells Peter whenever he asks how many times he should forgive his friend. Those who have been forgiven much should be quick to forgive others as well. Let's do one more story. If we go back to last week, you remember Christianity as discipleship. We base our understanding of what we are called to do based on Jesus' what? His teaching and his example. So not only did Jesus talk a lot about forgiving other people, we know that Jesus also practiced what he preached. He forgave people. So think about it like this. If you go to Luke's gospel, you jump all the way back to the very end. I believe it's chapter 23. So in chapter 23, we've seen all these things that have happened to Jesus. He's just been with his disciples, his closest friends, the people that have spent the last 3 years with. And when things get tough, what do? They bail on him. One's like, I don't even know the guy. A few verses later, we find that he is being beaten by the Roman soldiers and put thorns on his heads and stabbing him and cutting him up. He's then nailed to the cross, and he is there left to die. And we find that some of Jesus' last words as he's hanging there on the cross, Jesus looks out upon the people and he yells at them, just you wait, because I'm coming back. I hear it in Arnold Schwarzenegger's voice, right? I'll be back. And when I do come back, you will pay for this. Now, what are Jesus' actual words on the cross? He says, Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing. Jesus forgives, or at least he asks God to forgive the people who have abandoned him, the people who have beaten him, the people who are putting him on the cross and crucifying him. And I'm sure people were there like, you know what, that seems like that's too fast, Jesus. It's too soon. Like, you can't forgive like that. You have to have time to process this. Can't you hold these people accountable or something like that for what they've done? No, Jesus he forgives them right there and then. And what is the response of the centurion? He says, surely this was the Son of God. This is a transformative experience for the people who are hurting Jesus as well. We forgive people. We love our enemies, not just because Jesus said so, but because Jesus showed us how to do so. So I want to bring it all to a close this morning with a story that some of you have heard before, a story of one of the Anabaptist martyrs named Dirk Willems. And Dirk Willems is a well-known, well-loved martyr from our church tradition. And we've seen this picture, I've had it up here for most of our service, of Dirk going back onto I'll tell the story in a little bit. You've seen the picture up here a little bit. It's been made into different memes, into different pictures. You can buy a t-shirt with Dirk Willems on it. Love your enemies, bless those that curse you. I recently saw this one as well, and if you see this anywhere in a size large, think of your pastor. It says the Dirk Willems ice hockey team. So they just cut out this picture and they put a hockey stick. Yeah, if you find that, let me know. But here's the picture that we've grown to know and appreciate. And I think it was 1660, the first edition of the Martyr's Mirror was published. This is a 1,000-some page tome, story after story of 16th century Anabaptist martyrs. Actually, it goes all the way back to Jesus into the 1600s. Telling these different stories of the people who died for their faith and were faithful right up to the end. And probably one of the best known stories is the story of Dirk Willems. So in the second edition of the Martyr's Mirror, there are these illustrations that were added, and it's kind of interesting to hear how they came about. I guess, back in the 1600s, they didn't have graphic designers like they do today, but some guy did these like copper etchings, and then they rub graphite or coal or something on it and make these pictures. That's why they look kind of like this. But if you ever want to look through the Martyr's Mirror, I actually have one open right now over here next door, open to the story of Dirk Willems. This picture is in the front. So if you ever wonder why they kind of look like that, that's why. There's all sorts of cool pictures of the different people being martyrs. Some are hung from their toes from the ceiling. Some are being burned at the stake. Oh, it's real. Just very interesting and very graphic pictures. But I won't go into any more detail than that. But the story of Dirk Willems is one that has been important for our history, our past, and our tradition. And the story goes that Dirk Willems was arrested for the unimaginable crime of doing what? Of being rebaptized, as participating in an adult baptism, asking to be rebaptized on confession of faith. But not only that, do you know what else he did? He baptized other people. I know, he was a heretic, or so they said. So Dirk Willems was condemned to death because of his transgressions, because he baptized other people, because he was baptized again himself. He was convicted and sentenced in Asperen, Holland. He was a Dutch Mennonite. So in Holland, he was placed in house arrest. It was actually somebody else's house. Here is a castle. He was held up in the tower of the castle. As he was awaiting his own execution, he found some cloths, some old rags. He tied them together and fashioned a rope for himself. Dirk Willems then climbs out of the tower in the middle of the night to escape his death penalty. But as he is fleeing from the scene, not from the scene, but from his place of imprisonment, he's seen by other people, by the guards. And the guards begin to come after him, to chase him down. And as Dirk is running away, he comes up to a frozen pond or stream of some sort, a body of water. Now, this is the middle of the winter. It's like January. So Dirk is able to run across the frozen water. He's light. He's been in prison for a while. He's been eating prison rations. He is a little bit on the thin side. He scurries across the water, no problem. But behind him come these guards, and they're wearing armor, and they're well-fed. And the first one comes out on the ice, and what happens? The ice gives way, and he falls into the water. Well, the other guards, they're not going to go after him, because they too are going to fall in if they go after and try to save this other guard. But here is Dirk Willems. He's made it to the other side. He's safe. He is free. What does he decide to do? He turns back to save the life of the man who is pursuing him. He drags him out of the ice, out of the water, to the shore. And the man that he just saved pleads that they allow Dirk to go, to let him go. And they say, we can't. We've sworn an oath. So they arrest Dirk Willems, and he is stuck back in a prison where he stays until his death on May 16th, 1569, when he is burned at the stake. We have these stories in our tradition. Stories of enemy love, stories of forgiveness, stories that most of the time they don't make sense. Why would you forgive somebody for shooting up an Amish schoolhouse without properly taking the time, whatever the right amount of time might be? Why would you go back to save a guy who is trying to pursue you, to kill you, and save his life and offer your own life in his place? None of these things make sense abstracted from the life, death, and resurrection and teachings of Jesus. But when we take them all together, we have these stories that encourage us to go and do likewise. Let's pray. God, we thank you for these stories of people who are strong in their faith, who stood up and did the right thing even though it was costly to them. Lord, hopefully none of us will ever come to that place where we have to give of ourselves in such a way as Dirk Willems or others have had to do. But we pray that you help us, Lord, in our small problems to forgive those who have hurt us, even in the big problems as well. Help us, Lord, to show that kind of forgiveness and enemy love that you exemplified for us on the cross. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right, well, this brings us to the time of our service for the sharing of praises and prayer concerns.